Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. Today we're going to get right back on track and talk about our latest book club offering. In this case it is the book The Forgotten 500 by Gregory Freeman. I know I'm a little bit behind schedule with regards to the book club, so sorry about that, but I'm finally starting to get caught up and we can start to talk about the latest book that we chose for last month. So just right up front, before we get into the maps, I wanted to talk about the book itself. It's a very short read. It's only about 300 pages, so you can get through it pretty quickly. The ease of read is very easy to read, not very hard at all. You don't really need to have an understanding of what's going on or the history of the Balkan region. It does help because, as we know, this is probably the most complicated area of the whole planet to discuss in terms of the geopolitical history of how the region developed. You have to really have kind of like a very basic understanding, but the book kind of covers that as well because the book is trying to talk about a rescue mission. So that's the theme of the book. This is a book about a rescue mission that occurred during World War II in what was at the time Yugoslavia. Now, of course, we know that the book takes place, or the events in the book, the cities in the book mentioned, take place in what is now modern-day Serbia, but at the time it was Yugoslavia. Again, very contentious topic. This book would make a pretty good book if you're looking for something for like a homeschool curriculum for like maybe an older young adult, maybe kind of like high school age. This would be a fantastic book. There's not a whole lot of vulgarity in the book. There are some scenes of brutality for, obviously this is World War II. Not exactly a peaceful or happy time in many cases. However, it's pretty mild on that front. So if you're looking for a decently family-friendly book to give to, say, like a younger adult who's got maybe a little bit more advanced reading level, maybe high school level, this would be a good book for that. So for those of you who are looking for something, there you go. So what is the Forgotten 500 all about? Well, let's jump to the map and we'll talk about it. Looking at this map from the time period, we can see some of the challenges that the Allies might have had following their invasion of Sicily in 1943. Once the Allies invaded Sicily and that sort of campaign kicked off and they expanded northward into Italy, we can see that they had a few problems, namely the German occupation of the Balkan region and what to do about it. So, obviously, a lot of bombing raids of Allied forces were carried out from bases in Italy, and they were taking place over what at the time was Yugoslavia, sometimes stretching as far as Hungary or all the way over to Romania and Bulgaria. The Germans had occupied the region a few years before, and were trying to hold the region to make their eastern campaign go a little bit easier. So that's kind of the very broad brush understanding. Now, this book picks up where a lot of details sometimes get lost. So, as you have bombing raids, we all know the sort of target for tonight, the 12 o'clock high version of Americans and British airmen taking off from Britain, flying over Germany and dropping bombs on ball-bearing factories, right? Well, the same thing was going on down in the south, from Italy into this region. Well, the problem is that obviously warfare is a pretty risky business, and bombers are going to get shot down, or they're going to be disabled to the point where the crew has to bail out. So the United States and Britain find themselves in a situation where they've got a lot of downed airmen in Yugoslavia. So what do you do about it? Well, first of all, we have to have understanding of who was on the ground in the area. First of all, we have the German occupiers, the German army who was occupying the area, but we also have various partisan groups. We have various resistance groups that were local to the region that all had varying, contrasting sometimes views. One of the groups where the majority of Allied airmen sort of came under the purview of was led by General Draza Mihailovic. Now, please forgive me if I'm not explaining this quite right. It's very, very challenging to kind of paint the sort of Balkan region with a broad brush sometimes, and it's not as simple as good guy versus bad guy, as we all know throughout the history, but especially in this region. So it's very hard and sometimes very contentious to even describe what's going on in the region. But General Mihailovic was the leader of the Chetniks. This was a local resistance group of ethnic Serbs located in what is now modern-day Serbia, but at the time it was just basically a district of Yugoslavia or a region of Yugoslavia. And he did not like the Germans, so he was trying to fight off the occupying people who had invaded his country, right? So let's come back to the problem the Allies faced. They have a lot of allies, a lot of Allied airmen that are downed in the region. They've got to get back to their home base somehow. They've got to get back to friendly lines somehow. They've got resistance guys on the ground willing to help them for sure, and who are not super stoked to have the Germans in their country. So what do we do about this? Well, if you're the British and the Americans, you do pretty much exactly what you did in France and set up a coordination movement between the resistance groups on the ground and, say, the British Special Operations Executive, the precursor to MI6, and the American Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. So you can see how we get this sort of spy game going on here. Both of these agencies, both the British and the American, really sort of cut their teeth on these kinds of incidents throughout World War II. The Americans already having experience in Burma, and the British already having experience in France. So we set up a coordination effort. So the OSS and the SOE get together, set up a coordination effort with this guy, Mihailovich. Now, most of the book, at least the first half of the book, details the individual stories of the airmen that were shot down. So, and I think this is a lot less to do with politics at the time of the region. It was probably more to do with just the good nature of human beings and humanity at the time, which is that if there's a person who's shot down, they find themselves in slung under a parachute, floating gently down to a very unfriendly terrain. Well, their average citizen wanted to take care of that person. So, a lot of the people throughout the region just wanted to help anyone, really. And we see this quite often. We see a lot of Mihailovich's people not even really being affiliated with any resistance movement and just helping the airmen and getting them to the right people. So I think that it has less to do with the Serbs in the area at the time or the Yugoslavs in the area at the time wanting to combat the Germans, and this is just sort of the thing that they did. So the first half of the book really cements the sort of good nature of the people involved and the kindness, and this comes back at the very end of the book, so I feel like I have to mention it. It's not just a tactical or strategic sort of situation. There's a lot of humanity coming out here as well. So again, coming back to the Allies, what do? We've got a good resistance leader on the ground. We've got coordination with the resistance. How do we get our guys out? Well, if you look at the map, you can see that it's kind of a long way. And as you may not be able to see it from the map, but most of the area at the time was absolutely covered in trees. So as the book mentions, most of the Allies, even if they were damaged, they did not even attempt to make an emergency landing anywhere in this region. They just bailed out because they knew that there wasn't anywhere to land because of trees. So the Germans were fairly confident that there wouldn't be any sort of, crash landing attempts. It's all basically just, guys or airmen jumping out of their planes when they become damaged to the point where they can't continue. Because of this, the Germans also got a little sloppy, and they assumed that the Americans would not be able to conduct any sort of large operation because they just couldn't land any planes there. Remember, at the time, World War II, no helicopters, right? So you're only dealing with fixed-wing aircraft, which need a really long runway, right? So the Germans were fairly confident that the Allies could not land any aircraft in the area, so, they were kind of sloppy on that front. So as we can see, the Germans get a little bit complacent, and they don't necessarily start putting this many low-level anti-aircraft sites throughout their occupied terrain. Now, we can all see that this sort of sets the stage for what comes next. Enter Operation Halyard. This is the operation to do exactly what you might intuitively think. The Americans, the British, the Chetniks resistance fighters on the ground decided to all coordinate together to build an airfield. So they decide to build one major airfield. There were a couple of others that were sort of involved. This wasn't just one rescue mission. This was a several mission sort of thing. So they decided, let's cut an airfield in the middle of this forest here outside this town, and we'll make it so that an American aircraft can take off from Italy, fly really low, come in, land, get all of the American airmen that we have sort of gotten together, and put them on a plane and get them out of here. Sort of like a real-life Hogan's Heroes sort of situation. The resistance fighters would go out and find American airmen that were down. They would work with local people and sort of gather up all of the people who jumped out of their planes and parachuted down to Earth. They would get them together, run them through a secret network, rendezvous them at a site, plane would land, they would get on the plane and go back to Italy. So that's basically how Operation Halyard worked out. There was very little confidence in it working in the beginning, but after the first mission, it actually worked very, very well. And as we can see, little more than 500 airmen were able to get out of the area. So it's not just Americans or British; it's quite a few other Allied nations as well. Had personnel that were gotten out via this airstrip. So it's a fantastic story of evacuation, humanity, humans helping out their fellow man regardless of being able to speak the same language or having the same culture or anything. It's just the most wholesome story you could possibly imagine. Chetnik fighters going through the woods, taking fire, losing men of their own, in fact, in many cases, just to save one downed airman. That, is hard to top that in terms of, rescue missions and rescue stories. So why haven't we heard about it? Well, here's the sad part of the story, and why the book is called The Forgotten 500, and why the story was largely forgotten. Well, if we back up a little bit in the story, we remember that General Mihailovich was the leader of the Chetniks, right? Well, the Chetniks did not control the entire country. They really just controlled what is now sort of northwestern Serbia. At the time, it was like east central Yugoslavia. Well, up in the northwestern part of, at the time, what was Yugoslavia, now, which is sort of Bosnia and some parts of Croatia, there was another fella in town, and he was the leader of the partisans, and his name was Tito. The man, the myth, the legend, who eventually became known as Marshal Josip Broz Tito. So very, very controversial figure. He was essentially, I know it's a loaded word to say, but I think most people would consider him to be the dictator of Yugoslavia for many decades, until his death and the breakup of Yugoslavia and the subsequent Balkan Wars. So, the reason why this story is largely forgotten, and it did not get its own blockbuster hit featuring Steve McQueen or Gregory Peck, the reason for this is because the United States decided to, after the war, side with Tito. So, even though Mihailovich helped these airmen out, he was able to coordinate and get help out the United States, rescue their airmen, the most wholesome thing you could possibly do, right? The United States abandoned him in favor of Tito for a few reasons. So some of these reasons for the United States siding with Tito is, well, he had a larger resistance group for one, and Winston Churchill personally intervened because he thought that Mihailovich had communist ideations. There was also some conflict between Mihailovich and the UK, so it was just kind of like a lukewarm situation. There were some... the book, I'll mention this, and it's very inflammatory, and I don't know how historically accurate it is, but the book does mention it, so I think I'll mention it as well. The book sort of hints that this was a psyop within a psyop within a psyop sort of thing, where the OSS and the SOE had been infiltrated by communists, and those communists sort of spread the rumor that Mihailovich was a communist. And the higher-up leadership, Winston Churchill in particular, heard this, what is asserted to be a lie sort of thing, and said, oh, well, we don't want any commies, so we've already got enough trouble with the Soviets, so we don't need any more problems with communists, so drop this guy Mihailovich and go with this new guy Tito, see what he's got. He's more of a Yugoslavian nationalist anyway, so maybe that'll, work its way out after the war. Well, it turns out this isn't really true. Mihailovich was persecuted, targeted, and executed by Tito's government immediately after the war. And the United States and Britain are sort of left, with the surprise Pikachu face sort of thing, because they had put Tito in power, and now Tito is not doing anything remotely close to what the Allies wanted him to do. So, classic case of the United States sort of installing a leader who actually doesn't really, just results in a lot of conflict throughout the region. The United States and the UK, during this sort of kerfuffle, after World War II really just had to drop Mihailovich and kind of pretend that he never existed. They forgot these 500 airmen. They dropped the whole story. They swept it under the rug because if they publicized the fact that this guy had helped them out and saved hundreds of lives, then they would be admitting that they left their savior out to dry, that they sort of left him hanging. So really this is just an exercise in propaganda, information warfare, and covering up a story so that the United States and the UK don't look bad for hanging their friend out to dry. That's what this book is about. If you were expecting to come into this thinking, oh, it's just a rescue story of downed airmen during World War II, cool enough as is, but really just ends on a sort of foul and bitter note that reminds us that some very, very ugly things happening during World War II. And the Allies were not necessarily the good guys in many, many cases. After the war, after Mihailovich's death, and after it became clear that Tito was not their guy after all, and was they knew that he probably wasn't going to be their guy in the beginning, but they chose poorly, so to speak. But anyway, after it became clear that, and became public that through the surviving airmen who voiced their objections until the end of their days, once that became clear that the United States and the UK did the wrong thing and sort of left these guys out in the rain, both Eisenhower and Churchill attempted to make good on this. Churchill says this was, some sources claim that he said that this was his worst mistake of the war, not choosing to stand up for Mihailovich and sort of go along the lines of a more Serbian nationalistic route. And Eisenhower, after the war, ended up giving Mihailovich the Legion of Merit, posthumously, of course, and for his conduct during the war and things like that. So you can see where there is the tacit, sort of lukewarm admission, begrudgingly, that this was a very dirty, dirty deal. And of course, it's very, very complicated, but it also is a reminder, and this is a totally different topic, but it is kind of interesting that people outside the United States have long memories, have much longer memories than the United States, than the average American does, I think, especially for warfare, especially if they experienced a war in their own homeland. And I think that's very, very interesting. You see this sort of thing happening out in the East. Russia every single year still has sort of summer archaeological programs where they go out and they try to locate the graves and do remains recovery of the Battle of Stalingrad. So they do that every year. They do it up in the north as well, and things like that. There's and they have ceremonies. When they find remains, they rebury them. They have a whole big deal. So for Russia, it's a huge deal. Same thing in what is now modern-day Serbia. As a matter of fact, I'll throw it up on the screen here. They've actually just a couple of years ago unveiled a massive monument to the Americans and to the Chetniks and to those who lost their lives trying to get allies out of the region. So you can see that the locals absolutely remember what happened, even sometimes in some cases their parents weren't there. It was their grandparents or their great-grandparents that were involved in this sort of thing. So I find it very interesting to see, the younger generations in other countries having a more understanding respect for the events of World War II, and recognizing that it's not as simple as we might want to make it sometimes. So I think that's probably the overarching lesson that I think most people will kind of walk away from this as, not only will, the story of, government betrayal sort of, ring true for many people, but it's also the fact that we do remember these things, and no matter how much governments sometimes want to suppress their crimes, these things come out, and people remember, and they have very long memories in some cases. So a lot of times we can't do anything. We can't do anything to stop, a government from doing the wrong thing. We can't do anything to stop a conflict breaking out sometimes as an average person, but we can absolutely remember. That is the absolute least that you can do, no matter where you're at in the world, is remember. So, and I think that's probably one of the better lessons that we can learn from this book. It's not, again, something that you would probably read on your own if you had, the choice. If you saw this in the bookstore, you probably just walk right past it, not understanding that, we may try to get like some tactical or strategic knowledge in these days, because I think that, particularly if you're watching this, you're probably trying to learn as much as you possibly can, as efficiently as possible, and you're trying to just cram in a lot of knowledge before the knowledge becomes useful, you know what I mean? So, and I think that a lot of people would probably just kind of skip over this because, well, it's a good story, it's a good read, it's a well-written book, but it's not entirely applicable in terms of strategic or tactical, like densely packed knowledge that we're trying to go for sometimes. But sometimes it's good to take a break and remember what all this is for, and remember the warnings. Remember the things that can happen, and remember the bigger picture sometimes. So a lot of times, at least my takeaway from this book is, all we can do is remember what happened and make sure that people don't forget what happened, and that we don't make the same mistakes again. So I think I'll leave it there for today, and we'll move on to the next one. So thank you all for watching, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.